Today's message is called Be of Good Cheer, and I think this encouragement is something we can all need, especially in these times we live in with all the uncertainty and difficulties. Be of good cheer. I have to introduce it a bit. We are in book of Acts chapter 23. And we'll look only at the first 11 verses. And first we get the situation that Paul is in. He has been allowed by the Roman commander to speak to the multitude of Jews in Jerusalem. But as soon as he brought up, or actually mentioned the word Gentiles, the mob went wild, and he was then put back into custody. And now the Roman commander brings him before the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, in the hopes to get more clarity of what is actually the problem here. So that's where we're at. In Acts 23 verse 1 it says, Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. First of all, it says that Paul was earnestly beholding them. He was fervently looking at them. He was making eye contact. He was showing that he was extremely serious about the situation and about what he was going to say. He knew their position very well. He remembered, of course, that he was sitting there himself some 20 years earlier. And therefore, he addresses them with men and brethren, which normally if someone would appear before the council, he would not say that. He would say rulers of the people and elders of Israel. But Paul says men and brethren, showing that he is on the same level. He's with them. He identifies with them, as he has done before with the multitude, speaking to them in Hebrew and saying also at the very beginning, I am a Jew, and I was where you are now, being a Pharisee. So he keeps this same posture. He stays close to them in that respect. Also, of course, we have to realize that there was Roman supervision here at this point, and so calling them rulers of the people would also offend the Romans. Put the Jews of the council in a maybe difficult situation. Then he says, in good conscience before God. Now this was an offensive statement. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day, because he was there, because he was accused. He was the accused one. So how could he say he had been in good conscience before God until that very day? That is in other words saying that he shouldn't be there to be accused of anything. But of course the men in the council knew that that he was right, and they couldn't say anything about this. They could do something else in verse 2. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. This shows how offensive this remark was, this claim of good conscience. And so the high priest gave this order, this illegal order, to smite Paul. Jewish law said, he who strikes the cheek of an Israelite strikes, as it were, the glory of God. And another saying is, he who strikes a man strikes the Holy One. This was clearly not the way it should go. And Paul makes that clear. In verse 3 he says, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? Now Paul was not out for revenge, he left that to God. God will smite thee. But he does expose right away the hypocrisy of Ananias. He wanted to condemn Paul by using the law, and he was ordering Paul to be smitten against the law. Now, it's not just because of Jewish saying or tradition, it is literally written in the law. In Deuteronomy 25 verses 1 and 2 it says, if there be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down, and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. In other words, first there has to be a conviction before a judge, and then if the person is worthy to be beaten, he is beaten. Paul had not yet been found guilty for anything. That was actually the reason why he was there, to find out if there was anything against him, and what, if so. So this was clearly against the law. And Paul calls then also Ananias thou whited wall, or whitewashed wall. That means a wall that is actually dirty, or maybe has graffiti on it, or other impurity that is whitewashed. There is a white layer over it, a white layer of paint. It's just a thin layer, but it's totally not pure underneath. It's covered corruption. That is what he is saying. Hypocrisy. God will strike you. Vengeance is his. And actually, these words were prophetic, because Ananias was a man who was very corrupt. He had pro-Roman politics, so that he could stay in his position and get favors, and that would cause him eventually to be hunted down by his own people, to live like a hunted animal, you can say. And finally he would be brutally killed by his own people because of all this scheming, taking bribes, and these dark policies. So it was certainly would come to pass later on. But at this point it continues in verse 4, and they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Now, Paul uses his words very carefully and very wisely by the Holy Spirit. First of all, he said, I didn't know that this was the high priest, which means that apparently Ananias had not been introduced to him as the high priest. It was not a hearing following the normal procedures, because this was requested or ordered by the Romans, and there was Roman supervision, so things went a bit differently apparently. No one had told Paul that this was the high priest. And apparently Ananias was also not wearing his attire showing that he was a high priest. But more importantly, Paul was showing sarcastically that he was not behaving like a high priest. He gave this illegal order. This is not something a high priest should do. So he's also, in a way, condemning him for that. But right away, Paul also admits his error. Okay, if this is the high priest, I should not have done this, should not have said this, because thou should not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Now he does what he didn't do in the introduction. He calls Ananias the ruler of the people before the Romans, who are actually the rulers of the people. So sort of saying Ananias is competing with the Romans to rule over the people. This would give at least the Roman commander some thoughts. But this saying, thou shalt not speak evil of the rule of thy people, he says this is written, and this is also in the law. The people, the men there that heard him quote this, would have known right away what was written and how it is written. And it is actually to be found in Exodus 22 in verse 28, and there it says, thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people. It's a bit unfortunate translation here from King James. Thou shalt not revile the gods. It's plural, Elohim. But other translations say thou art not to curse God, nor curse the ruler of thy people. That's more accurate. Now, Paul only quotes the second part. Thou shalt not curse the ruler of the people. He doesn't say the first part. And of course, all these scribes and Pharisees, they knew the law very well. They would have thought right away, hey, this is only half of the verse, of the sentence. But no one dared to say anything, because the first half was condemning them. Thou shalt not revile God. Thou shalt not curse God. That's exactly what they were doing. They were acting against the law themselves. So by admitting that he should not have said this to the ruler of the people, Paul was accusing them, and the high priest in particular, of cursing God, which indirectly he was. It's comparable to what Jesus did when they brought the adulterous woman before him. He said, he who is without sin, let him throw the first stone. Therewith not denying the sin, but showing you sin equally or more greatly. And this is what Paul was doing the same way. But it also is clear that being reasonable didn't bring anything. They could go on like this for a long time, quoting the law and playing with words. And actually, rabbis like to do this. Even today, they can spend hours and days at length playing with words, basically. But it doesn't lead anywhere. And Paul realized that. But he had been a member of the Sanhedrin himself. He knew their weak spot. And that's where he would go now. Their weak spot was that they were divided over the resurrection, over the existence of angels and spirits. The Pharisees believed this, but the Sadducees did not. So even when Paul was in the Sanhedrin, this was always been a subject of dispute and division. And of course, it's a very important issue, the resurrection, because that's the core of the gospel of Jesus. Without resurrection, the whole message of the gospel falls apart. So instead of having the whole council against him, Paul would bring up this subject and get at least part of the council for him. And that's what happens in verse 6. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question. So he brings up the resurrection and he says, I was brought up like a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection. He doesn't yet link it to the resurrection of Jesus, but simply bringing up the resurrection in general. That one remark was enough to divide the council. That happens in verse 7. And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. Verse 8, For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit. but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees part arose and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. These Pharisees echo the words that Gamaliel spoke 20 years earlier when Paul was in the Sanhedrin. But what's very important here is that from their mouth, the Romans that were present there hear, we find no evil in this man. They say it, there is no evil, that Paul didn't do anything wrong. And that is very important for the Roman commander to hear that actually the council was just playing with words, but they had nothing against Paul. Now, it may have seemed a clever tactic to divide the council like this, and of course it had a favorable effect for Paul. As said, part of the council was now for him, and it was also spoken that there was no evil in Paul. But Paul was not so happy about himself, because it caused that he could not further expound on the resurrection and in particular on the gospel. And he would later admit to Felix, the governor, that he regretted this. And this in Acts 24. If we fast forward to that in verse 20 and 21, Paul says, or let these same here say if they have found any evil doing in me, while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice, that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So he says this is the one thing that they may accuse me of, that I brought up resurrection and caused this uproar. It caused so much uproar that the Romans ended this hearing before the Sanhedrin and took Paul away and brought him into the castle, in verse 10. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. So they were arguing among them and, as it were, pulling on Paul on both sides. And the commander thought they will pull him into pieces. Let's take him out. And basically, he had actually heard enough also. So again, Paul is in custody, in protective custody, actually. But Paul was feeling unhappy. He was feeling unhappy. He had a great opportunity to speak to the multitude of Jews on the Temple Mount. He had a great opportunity to speak to the Jewish religious leaders in the council. He had these opportunities to preach the gospel to his own people. This was really the desire of his heart all along. But when he spoke to the Jews on the Temple Mount, everything went haywire as soon as he mentioned the word Gentiles. And when he spoke in the council, everything went haywire when he mentioned the word resurrection. And therefore he could not further speak about the gospel. And so Paul was feeling down. And he really needed comfort and encouragement in this situation. He was in jail, alone, in the darkness, feeling depressed about this result. He needed comfort, and it came right when he needed it most. God is faithful. In verse 11, and the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. When we feel unable and unworthy in the dark of the night, when we are ready to give up, this is what happens. The Lord stands by us. It's what he promised. The last words of Jesus that we read at the very end of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 28, Jesus promises, right after he gives the commission to preach the gospel, he says, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. That is his promise. And he is true to his promise, as we see here. It shows that we are not carrying the burden alone. In fact, we are not carrying it at all. It's his yoke, as he says in Matthew 11. Take my yoke upon you. And we spoke extensively about this in other messages. It's like two beasts of burden under one yoke. One trained animal that has done this for years, and one new animal. The trained animal is actually doing all the work, practically all the work. And the other one is just walking along, learning and getting accustomed. We are not carrying the burden alone. We see that Paul did not receive a vision or a dream. He receives a visit. Jesus was there. He was standing by him, it says. And Jesus had been with him all along, but now appeared physically. Isn't that encouraging? If we walk in his will, he is with us. He knows where we are. He knows how we feel. Even in the dark of the night. Even in the valley of the shadow of death. Now, as we go through the book of Acts, there are quite a few instances where we have people in jail, whether it be Paul or Peter or other people. And there have been various spectacular escapes from prison. This had happened even to Paul. But this time, Jesus doesn't take Paul out of prison, but he meets him there. Right there in prison. God does not always take us out of the difficult circumstances. But sometimes, or oftentimes, he wants to meet us right there. Sometimes he does not spare us from difficulties. But he leads us through them. Like he led the Israelites through the Red Sea. He didn't take the sea away. He didn't give them another route, he led them through it. Paul was distressed, he was depressed, and he was there. It was night, it says. It was in the darkness of the night, reflecting the spiritual darkness that was upon him. And the jail was reflecting his incapability. He was locked up, he couldn't do anything. He was helpless. This is a situation we can all relate to a certain extent. Being depressed, feeling helpless, and feeling oppressed by darkness. And things would get worse even the next day. But Paul didn't know that yet, of course, but Jesus did. And yet Jesus says, be of good cheer, Paul. And it's easy to be of good cheer when things go fine. When everything goes fine, it's easy. But when everything goes wrong, it's very difficult. When everything is falling apart, it's easier to get depressed and to forget that Jesus is in control and that all things work together for good for those who love God. Be of good cheer. It's a very simple thing, and it's actually all that Jesus says. Be of good cheer. And in Greek, it's just one word. Tharsi. And this word is used 5 times in the New Testament. Now, 5 being the number of grace, because it's absolutely grace that we can be of good cheer, because Jesus is standing with us. It's 5 times we find it in Matthew 9 verse 2, is the first time where Jesus speaks to the paralytic. He says, "Son, be of good cheer, your sins have been forgiven you." And in the same chapter, in verse 22, Jesus says to the diseased woman, "Be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well." And then in Matthew 14, verse 27, Jesus speaks to his disciples on the sea. He says again, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And in John 16, verse 33, again, Jesus speaking to his disciples shortly before his crucifixion, "Be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." And then lastly here to Paul in prison. Cheer is the last thing we think of when we are go through times of misery. But it's the first thing Jesus wants to bring to our mind. Be of good cheer, be reassured. Even before things get better. In all these 5 cases, Jesus speaks these words before things get better. Paul is still in jail. He still is in the exact same situation. Nothing has basically changed. The paralytic that is brought before Jesus, he's still paralyzed. He can't walk. But Jesus says, "Be of good cheer." And etc. So, this is the first thing Jesus wants us to think of. He doesn't bring first miracles, healing, escapes from prison and all kinds of miraculous things and then say be of good cheer. The other way around. It's the same when the Israelites went through the Red Sea and Moses was on his face on the floor crying out to God. God said, what are you doing there? Get up. I will do the work. He didn't use these literal words, but you could say, be of good cheer. I'm here. I will get you out of this situation. But they still had the sea before them and the Egyptians behind them. How can we be of good cheer before things get better? Only through faith. Only through faith. It requires faith. In all these cases, Jesus says it even literally to the diseased woman, "Your faith has made you well." The paralyzed man the same. It was the faith of his friends who let him down through the roof. It was their faith, their persistence that they believed that caused Jesus to say, "Be of good cheer." Jesus also reminds Paul of a very important principle when preaching the gospel, and it's really something we should take at heart, especially in these difficult times we live in, where we are met almost only with rejection, almost only. Paul was stuck on the poor results of the situations he had been in. Now our responsibility is to spread the gospel. That is what Jesus has commissioned us to do. The results, however, they depend on the heart of the receiver. And ultimately, that is God's responsibility. As it's been said, we can do the sowing, but God does the growing. It's not in our hands. Paul actually had done a good job. Be of good cheer. Well done. Jesus says, you have testified of me in Jesus. You've done your job. You've done what I asked you to do. So must you also bear witness of me in Rome. Now a lazy servant wants to hear, well done, you can rest now. But a faithful servant wants to hear, well done, there's more for you to do. It also meant something else, namely that Paul would not perish in Jerusalem. God would protect him until the work was done. There was more to do in Rome. They were a couple of years ahead of Paul in his life, and these would be years full of anxiety and delays and uncertainty. But Paul would go through them with calm and dignity. Why? Because Jesus had personally visited him and told him to be of good cheer. This is a message of both serious instruction and of encouragement. The instruction, the commission, is to spread the gospel. That is what Jesus says in Matthew 28 verses 19 and 20. And that commission is then sealed with this promise. After Jesus says this, right away, same sentence, same verse, and lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. And he says, Amen. In other words, so be it. So that's a reason to be reassured, to be cheerful, regardless of the results. And that is extra encouraging, that it is the labor that counts, the labor which is a result of faith. It's not works to earn anything, it's the result of faith. It's the labor that counts, not the result. And the result is not in our hands, actually. And Jesus told both the servants, both the servant who gained 5 talents and the one who gained 2 talents, the same thing in Matthew 25. And you see the result was different in absolute sense, but there was a result anyway. But it's what they did that prompted them, the Lord to say what he said in Matthew 25 verse 21. To the one who had 5 talents, his Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things, and I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. And to the one who had 2 talents, he says the exact same thing in verse 23. His Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Same thing. Now in our times, results of evangelizing is poorer than ever. The church consists mainly of people who sit on their 1 talent. They sit on their lease, to use an Old Testament expression. And the world, at the same time, is filled with the spirit of Antichrist like never before. But be of good cheer. Jesus is right there. God is in control. Even in the valley of the shadow of death. Even in the midst of the storm. Sometimes he allows us to walk on the water. Other times he parts the sea. And again other times he calms the waves, he calms the storm. No matter what, he will get us to the other side. He will get us through. Be of good cheer if we just trust and have faith. Be of good cheer. Amen.